This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in May 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 35. It would be most an hour yet till breakfast, so we left and struck down into the woods, because Tom said we got to have some light to see how to dig by, and a lantern makes too much and might get us into trouble. What we must have was a lot of them rotten chunks that's called foxfire, and just makes a soft kind of a glow when you lay them in a dark place. We fetched an armful and hid it in the weeds and set down to rest, and Tom says, kind of dissatisfied, "Blame it, this whole thing is just as easy and awkward as it can be, and so it makes it so rotten difficult to get up a difficult plan. There ain't no watchman to be drugged. Now there ought to be a watchman. There ain't even a dog to give a sleeping mixture to. And there's Jim chained by one leg with a 10-foot chain to the leg of his bed. Why, all you got to do is lift up the bedstead and slip off the chain. And Uncle Silas, he trusts everybody. Sends the key to the pumpkin-headed nigger, and don't send nobody to watch the nigger. Jim could have got out of that window hole before this, only there wouldn't be no use trying to travel with a 10-foot chain on his leg. Why, drat it, Huck, it's the stupidest arrangement I ever see. You got to invent all the difficulties. Well, we can't help it. We got to do the best we can with the materials we've got. Anyhow, there's one thing. There's more honor in getting him out through a lot of difficulties and dangers where there weren't one of them furnished to you by the people who it was their duty to furnish them, and you had to contrive them all out of your own head. Now, look at just that one thing in the lantern. When you come down to the cold facts, we simply got to let on that a lantern's risky. Why, we could work with a torchlight procession if we wanted to, I believe. Now, whilst I think of it, we got to hunt up something to make a saw out of the first chance we get. What do we want of a saw? What do we want of a saw? Hain't we got to saw the leg of Jim's bed off so as to get the chain loose? Why, you just said a body could lift up the bedstead and slip the chain off. Well, if that ain't just like you, Huck Finn. You can get up the infant schooliest ways of going at a thing. Why, hain't you ever read any books at all? Baron Trank, nor Casanova, nor Benvenuto Cellini, nor Henry IV, nor none of them heroes? Who ever heard of getting a prisoner loose in such an old maidy way as that? No, the way all the best authorities does is to saw the bed leg in two and leave it just so, and swallow the sawdust so it can't be found, and put some dirt and grease around the sawed place, so the very keenest senescal can't see no sign of its being sawed, and thinks the bed leg is perfectly sound. Then the night you're ready, fetch the leg a kick. Down she goes, slip off your chain, and there you are. Nothing to do but hitch your rope ladder to the battlements, shin down it, break your leg in the moat, because a rope ladder is 19 foot too short, you know. And there's your horses and your trusty vassals, and they scoop you up and fling you across the saddle, and away you go to your native Languedoc or Navarre or wherever it is. It's gaudy, Huck. I wish there was a moat to this cabin. If we get time, the night of the escape, we'll dig one. I says, what do we want of a moat when we're going to snake him out from under the cabin? But he never heard me. He had forgot me and everything else. He had his chin in his hand, thinking. Pretty soon he sighs and shakes his head, then sighs again and says, "No, it wouldn't do. There ain't necessity enough for it." "For what?" I says. "Why, to saw Jim's leg off," he says. "Good land!" I says. "Why, there ain't no necessity for it. And what would you want to saw his leg off for, anyway?" "Well, some of the best authorities has done it. They couldn't get the chain off, so they just cut their hand off and shoved. And a leg would be better still. But we got to let that go. There ain't necessity enough in this case. And besides, Jim's a nigger, wouldn't understand the reasons for it, and how it's the custom in Europe. So we'll let it go. But there's one thing. He can have a rope ladder. We can tear up our sheets and make him a rope ladder easy enough, and we can send it to him in a pie. It's mostly done that way, and I've ate worse pies. Why, Tom Sawyer, how you talk, I says. Jim ain't got no use for a rope ladder. He has got use for it. How you talk, you better say. You don't know nothing about it. He's got to have a rope ladder. They all do. What in the nation can he do with it? Do with it? He can hide it in his bed, can't he? That's what they all do, and he's got to, too. Huck, you don't ever seem to want to do anything that's regular. You want to be starting something fresh all the time. Suppose he don't do nothing with it. Ain't it there in his bed for a clue after he's gone? And don't you reckon they'll want clues? Of course they will. And you wouldn't leave them any? That would be a pretty howdy-do, wouldn't it? I never heard of such a thing. Well, I says, if it's in the regulations and he's got to have it, all right, let him have it, because I don't wish to go back on no regulations. But there's one thing, Tom Sawyer. If we go to tearing up our sheets to make Jim a rope ladder, we're going to get into trouble with Aunt Sally just as sure as you're born. Now, the way I look at it, a hickory bark ladder don't cost nothing, and don't waste nothing, and is just as good to load up a pie with and hide in a straw tick as any rag ladder you can start. And as for Jim, he ain't had no experience, and so he don't care what kind of a— Oh, shucks, Huck Finn. If I was as ignorant as you, I'd keep still, that's what I'd do. Who ever heard of a state prisoner escaping by a hickory bark ladder? Why, it's perfectly ridiculous. Well, all right, Tom, fix it your own way. But if you'll take my advice, you'll let me borrow a sheet off of the clothesline. He said that would do, and that give him another idea, and he says, borrow a shirt, too. What do we want of a shirt, Tom? Want it for Jim to keep a journal on. Journal your granny. Jim can't write. Suppose he can't write. He can make marks on the shirt, can't he, if we make him a pen out of an old pewter spoon or a piece of an old iron barrel hoop? Why, Tom, we can pull a feather out of a goose and make him a better one, and quicker, too. Prisoners don't have geese running around the dungeon keep to pull pens out of, you muggins. They always make their pens out of the hardest, toughest, troublesomest piece of old brass candlestick or something like that they can get their hands on. And it takes them weeks and weeks and months to file it out, too, because they've got to do it by rubbing it on the wall. They wouldn't use a goose quill if they had it. It ain't regular. Well, then, what'll we make him the ink out of? Manny makes it out of iron rust and tears, but that's the common sort in women. The best authorities uses their own blood. Jim can do that, and when he wants to send any little common, ordinary, mysterious message to let the world know where he's captivated, he can write it on the bottom of a tin plate with a fork and throw it out of the window. The Iron Mask always done that, and it's a blame good way, too. Jim ain't got no tin plates. They feed him in a pan. That ain't nothing. We can get him some. Can't nobody read his plates. That hain't got anything to do with it, Huck. All he's got to do is write on the plate and throw it out. You don't have to be able to read it. Why, half the time you can't read anything a prisoner writes on a tin plate or anywhere else. Well, then, what's the sense in wasting the plates? Why, blame it all, it ain't the prisoner's plates. But it's somebody's plates, ain't it? Well, supposing it is, what does the prisoner care who's— He broke off there because we heard the breakfast horn blowing, so we cleared out for the house. Along during the morning I borrowed a sheet and a white shirt off of the clothesline, and I found an old sack and put them in it, and we went down and got the foxfire and put that in it, too. I call it borrowing, because that was what Pap always called it, but Tom said it warn't borrowing, it was stealing. He said we was representing prisoners, and prisoners don't care how they get a thing, so they get it, and nobody don't blame them for it either. It ain't no crime in a prisoner to steal things he needs to get away with, Tom said. It's his right, and so as long as we was representing a prisoner, we had a perfect right to steal anything on this place we had the least use for to get ourselves out of prison with. He said if we weren't prisoners, it would be a very different thing, and nobody but a mean, ornery person would steal when he warn't a prisoner. So we allowed we would steal everything there was that come handy, and yet he made a mighty fuss one day after that when I stole a watermelon out of the nigger patch and ate it, and he made me go and give the niggers a dime without telling them what it was for. Tom said that what he meant was we could steal anything we needed. Well, I says I needed the watermelon, but he said I didn't need it to get out of prison with. That's where the difference was. He said if I'd wanted it to hide a knife in and smuggle it to Jim to kill the seneschal with, it would have been all right. So I let it go with that, though I couldn't see no advantage in my representing a prisoner if I got to sit down and chaw over a lot of gold leaf distinctions like that every time I see a chance to hog a watermelon. Well, as I was saying, we waited that morning till everybody was settled down to business, and nobody in sight around the yard. Then Tom, he carried the sack into the lean-to, whilst I stood off a piece to keep watch. By and by he come out, and we went and sit down on the woodpile to talk. He says, "Everything's all right now except tools, and that's easy fixed." "Tools?" I says. "Yes." "Tools for what?" "Why, to dig with. We ain't a-going to gnaw him out, are we?" "Ain't them old crippled picks and things in there good enough to dig a nigger out with?" I says. He turns on me, looking pitying enough to make a body cry, and says, "Huck Finn, did you ever hear of a prisoner having picks and shovels and all the modern conveniences in his wardrobe to dig himself out with? Now, I want to ask you, if you got any reasonableness in you at all, what kind of a show would that give him to be a hero? Why, they might as well lend him the key and done with it. Picks and shovels, why, they wouldn't furnish 'em to a king." "Well, then," I says, "if we don't want the picks and shovels, what do we want?" "A couple of case knives." "To dig the foundation out from under that cabin with?" "Yes." "Confound it, it's foolish, Tom." "It don't make no difference how foolish it is. It's the right way, and it's the regular way, and there ain't no other way that ever I heard of, and I've read all the books that gives any information about these things. They always dig out with a case knife, and not through dirt, mind you. Generally it's through solid rock, and it takes them weeks and weeks and weeks, and forever and ever. Why, look at one of them prisoners in the bottom dungeon of the Castle Deef in the harbor of Marseilles that dug himself out that way. How long was he at it, you reckon?" "I don't know." "Well, guess." "I don't know, a month and a half." 37 years, and he come out in China. That's the kind. I wish the bottom of this fortress was solid rock." "Jim don't know nobody in China." "What's that got to do with it? Neither did that other fellow. But you're always a-wandering off on a side issue. Why can't you stick to the main point?" "All right, I don't care where he comes out, so he comes out. And Jim don't either, I reckon. But there's one thing anyway. Jim's too old to be dug out with a case knife. He won't last." "Yes, he will last, too. You don't reckon it's going to take 37 years to dig out through a dirt foundation, do you?" "How long will it take, Tom?" "Well, we can't risk being as long as we ought to, because it mayn't take very long for Uncle Silas to hear from down there by New Orleans. He'll hear Jim ain't from there. Then his next move will be to advertise Jim or something like that. So we can't risk being as long digging him out as we ought to. By rights, I reckon we ought to be a couple of years, but we can't. Things being so uncertain, what I recommend is this, that we really dig right in as quick as we can, and after that we can let on to ourselves that we was at it 37 years. Then we can snatch him out and rush him away the first time there's an alarm. Yes, I reckon that'll be the best way." "Now, there's sense in that," I says. "Letting on don't cost nothing. Letting on ain't no trouble, and if it's any object, I don't mind letting on we was at 150 year. It wouldn't strain me none, after I got my hand in. So I'll mosey along now and smouch a couple of case knives." "Smouch 3, he says. "We want to make a saw out of it." "Tom, "If it ain't unregular and irreligious to suggest it," I says, "there's an old rusty saw blade around yonder, sticking under the weatherboarding behind the smokehouse." He looked kind of weary and discouraged like, and says, "It ain't no use to try to learn you nothing, Huck. Run along and smouch the knives, 3 of them." So I done it. End of chapter 35. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in May 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 36. As soon as we reckoned everybody was asleep that night, we went down the lightning rod and shut ourselves up in the lean-to and got out our pile of foxfire and went to work. We cleared everything out of the way, about 4 or 5 foot along the middle of the bottom log. Tom said we was right behind Jim's bed now, and we'd dig in under it, and when we got through there, couldn't nobody in the cabin ever know there was any hole there, because Jim's counterpin hung down most to the ground, and you'd have to raise it up and look under to see the hole. So we dug and dug with the case knives till most midnight, and then we was dog-tired and our hands was blistered, and yet you couldn't see we'd done hardly anything. At last I says, "This ain't no 37-year job. This is a 38-year job, Tom Sawyer." He never said nothing, but he sighed, and pretty soon he stopped digging, and then for a good little while I knowed that he was thinking. Then he says, "It ain't no use, Huck, it ain't a-going to work. If we was prisoners it would, because then we'd have as many years as we wanted, and no hurry, and we couldn't get but a few minutes to dig every day while they was changing watches, and so our hands wouldn't get blistered, and we could keep it up right along, year in and year out, and do it right, and the way it ought to be done. But we can't fool along. We got to rush. We ain't got no time to spare. If we was to put in another night this way, we'd have to knock off for a week to let our hands get well. Couldn't touch a case knife with them sooner." "Well, then, what we going to do, Tom?" "I'll tell you. It ain't right, and it ain't moral, and I wouldn't like it to get out, but there ain't only just the one way. We got to dig him out with the picks and let on it's case knives." "Now you're talking," I says. "Your head gets leveler and leveler all the time, Tom Sawyer," I says. "Picks is the thing, moral or no moral. And as for me, I don't care shucks for the morality of it nohow. When I start in to steal a nigger or a watermelon or a Sunday school book, I ain't noways particular how it's done, so it's done. What I want is my nigger, or what I want is my watermelon, or what I want is my Sunday school book. And if a pick's the handiest thing, that's the thing I'm a-going to dig that nigger or that watermelon or that Sunday school book out with, and I don't give a dead rat what the authorities thinks about it nuther." "Well," he says, "there's excuse for picks and letting on in a case like this. If it warn't so, I wouldn't approve of it, nor I wouldn't stand by and see the rules broke, because right is right and wrong is wrong, and a body ain't got no business doing wrong when he ain't ignorant and knows better. It might answer for you to dig Jim out with a pick, without any letting on, because you don't know no better, but it wouldn't for me because I do know better. Give me a case knife." He had his own by him, but I handed him mine. He flung it down and says, "Give me a case knife." I didn't know just what to do, but then I thought. I scratched around amongst the old tools and got a pickaxe and give it to him, and he took it and went to work and never said a word. He was always just that particular, full of principle. So then I got a shovel, and we picked and shoveled, turned about, and made the fur fly. We stuck to it about a half an hour, which is as long as we could stand up, but we had a good deal of a hole to show for it. When I got upstairs I looked out at the window and see Tom doing his level best with the lightning rod, but he couldn't come it, his hands was so sore. At last he says, "It ain't no use, it can't be done. What you reckon I better do? Can't you think of no way?" "Yes," I says, "but I reckon it ain't regular. Come up the stairs and let on it's a lightning rod." So he done it. Next day Tom stole a pewter spoon and a brass candlestick in the house for to make some pens for Jim out of, and 6 tallow candles, and I hung around the nigger cabins and laid for a chance, and stole 3 tin plates. Tom says it wasn't enough, but I said nobody wouldn't ever see the plates that Jim throwed out, because they'd fall in the dog fennel and Jimson weeds under the window hole. Then we could tote them back, and he could use them over again. So Tom was satisfied. Then he says, "Now, the thing to study out is how to get the things to Jim." "Take them in through the hole," I says, "when we get it done." He only just looked scornful, and said something about nobody ever heard of such an idiotic idea, and then he went to studying. By and by he said he had ciphered out 2 or 3 ways, but there warn't no need to decide on any of them yet. Said we got to post Jim first. That night we went down the lightning rod a little after 10, and took one of the candles along, and listened under the window hole and heard Jim snoring. So we pitched it in, and it didn't wake him. Then we whirled in with the pick and shovel, and in about 2 hours and a half the job was done. We crept in under Jim's bed and into the cabin, and pawed around and found the candle and lit it, and stood over Jim a while, and found him looking hearty and healthy. And then we woke him up gentle and gradual. He was so glad to see us he most cried, and called us honey, and all the pet names he could think of, and was for having us hunt up a cold chisel to cut the chain off of his leg with right away, and clearing out without losing any time. But Tom, he showed him how unregular it would be, and set down and told him all about our plans, and how we could alter them in a minute any time there was an alarm, and not to be the least afraid, because we would see he got away, sure. So Jim, he said it was all right, and we sat there and talked over old times a while. And then Tom asked a lot of questions, and when Jim told him Uncle Silas come in every day or 2 to pray with him, and Aunt Sally come in to see if he was comfortable and had plenty to eat, and both of them was as kind as they could be, Tom says, "Now I know how to fix it. We'll send you some things by them." I said, "Don't do nothing of the kind. It's one of the most jackass ideas I ever struck." But he paid no attention to me, went right on. It was his way when he'd got his plans set. So he told Jim how we'd have to smuggle in the rope ladder pie and other large things by Nat, the nigger that fed him, and he must be on the lookout and not be surprised, and not let Nat see him open them, and we would put small things in Uncle's coat pockets, and he must steal them out, and we would tie things to Aunt's apron springs, or put them in her apron pocket if we got a chance, and told him what they would be and what they was for, and told him how to keep a journal on the shirt with his blood and all that. He told him everything. Jim, he couldn't see no sense in the most of it, but he allowed we was white folks, and knowed better than him, so he was satisfied and said he would do it all just as Tom said. Jim had plenty corn-cob pipes and tobacco, so we had a right down good sociable time. Then we crawled out through the hole, and so home to bed, with hands that looked like they'd been chawed. Tom was in high spirits. He said it was the best fun he ever had in his life, and the most intellectual, and said if he only could see his way to it, we would keep it up all the rest of our lives, and leave Jim to our children to get out, for he believed Jim would come to like it better and better the more he got used to it. He said that in that way it could be strung out to as much as 80 a year, and would be the best time on record, and he said it would make us all celebrated that had a hand in it. In the morning we went out to the woodpile and chopped up the brass candlestick into handy sizes, and Tom put them and the pewter spoon in his pocket. Then we went to the nigger cabins, and while I got Nat's notice off, Tom shoved a piece of candlestick into the middle of a corn pone that was in Jim's pan, and we went along with Nat to see how it would work, and it just worked noble. When Jim bit into it, It most mashed all his teeth out, and there warn't ever anything could have worked better. Tom said so himself. Jim, he never let on but what it was only just a piece of rock or something like that that's always getting into bread, you know. But after that he never bit into nothing but what he jabbed his fork into it in 3 or 4 places first. And whilst we was a-standing there in the dim-ish light, here comes a couple of the hounds, bulging in from under Jim's bed, and they kept on piling in till there was 11 of them, and there warn't hardly room in there to get your breath. By jings, we forgot to fasten that lean-to door. The nigger Nat, he only just hollered, "Witches!" once, and keeled over onto the floor amongst the dogs and begun to groan like he was dying. Tom jerked the door open and flung out a slab of Jim's meat, and the dogs went for it, and in 2 seconds he was out himself and back again and shut the door, and I knowed he'd fix the other door too. Then he went to work on the nigger, coaxing him and petting him and asking him if he'd been imagining he saw something. He raised up and blinked his eyes around and says, "Mars Sid, you'll say I's a fool, but if I didn't believe I seen most 1,000,000 dogs, or devils or summin, I wisht I made that right here in these tracks. I did, most surely. Mars Sid, I felt 'em. I felt 'em, sir. They was all over me. They had to fetch it. I just wished I could get my hands on one of them witches just onct, only just onct. It's all I'd asked. But mostly I wish they'd let me alone, I does." Tom says, "Well, I tell you what I think. What makes them come here, just at this runaway nigger's breakfast time? It's because they're hungry, that's the reason. You make them a witch pie. That's the thing for you to do." "But, my land, Mars Sid, how's I gwine to make 'em a witch pie? I don't know how to make it. I hain't ever hearn of such a thing before." "Well, then I'll have to make it myself." "Will you do it, honey? Will you? I'll worship the ground under your foot, I will." "All right, I'll do it, seeing it's you, and you been good to us and showed us the runaway nigger. But you got to be mighty careful. When we come around, you turn your back, and then whatever we've put in the pan, don't you let on you see it at all. And don't you look when Jim unloads the pan. Something might happen, I don't know what. And above all, don't you handle the witch things." "Handle 'em, Mars Sid? What is you a-talking about? I wouldn't lay the weight of my finger on 'em, not for 10,000,000,000,000,000 dollars, I wouldn't." End of chapter 36. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in June 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 37. That was all fixed. So then we went away and went to the rubbish pile in the backyard, where they keep the old boots and rags and pieces of bottles and wore-out tin things and all such truck, and scratched around and found an old tin washpan and stopped up the holes as well as we could to bake the pie in, and took it down cellar and stole it full of flour and started for breakfast, and found a couple of shingle nails that Tom said would be handy for a prisoner to scrabble his name and sorrows on the dungeon walls with, and dropped one of them in Aunt Sally's apron pocket, which was hanging on a chair, and the other we stuck in the band of Uncle Silas's hat, which was on the bureau, because we heard the children say their pa and ma was going to the runaway nigger's house this morning, and then went to breakfast, and Tom dropped the pewter spoon in Uncle Silas's coat pocket, and Aunt Sally wasn't come yet, so we had to wait a little while. And when she come, she was hot and red and cross, and couldn't hardly wait for the blessing, and then she went to sluicing out coffee with one hand and cracking the handiest child's head with her thimble with the other, and says, "I've hunted high and I've hunted low, and it does beat all what has become of your other shirt." My heart fell down amongst my lungs and livers and things, and a hard piece of corn crust started down my throat after it and got me on the road with a cough, and was shot across the table and took one of the children in the eye and curled him up like a fishing worm, and let a cry out of him the size of a war whoop. and Tom, he turned kinder blue around the gills, and it all amounted to a considerable state of things for about a quarter of a minute, or as much as that, and I would 'a' sold out for half price if there was a bidder. But after that we was all right again. It was the sudden surprise of it that knocked us kind of cold. Uncle Silas, he says, "It's most uncommon curious. I can't understand it. I know perfectly well I took it off because you hain't got but one on. Just listen at the man. I know you took it off, and know it by a better way than your wool-gathering memory, too, because it was on the clothesline yesterday. I see it there myself. But it's gone. That's the long and short of it, and you'll just have to change to a red flannel one till I can get time to make a new one. And it'll be the third one I've made in 2 years. It just keeps a body on the jump to keep you in shirts, and whatever you do manage to do with 'em all is more'n I can make out. A body'd think you would learn to take some sort of care of 'em at your time of life." "I know it, Sally. I do try all I can, but it oughtn't to be altogether my fault, because, you know, I don't see them nor have nothing to do with them except when they're on me, and I don't believe I've ever lost one of them off of me." "Well, it ain't your fault if you haven't, Silas. You'd 'a' done it if you could, I reckon. And the shirt ain't all that's gone, nuther. There's a spoon gone, and that ain't all. There was 10, and now there's only 9. The calf got the shirt, I reckon, but the calf never took the spoon, that's certain." "Why, what else is gone, Sally?" "There's 6 candles gone, that's what. The rats could 'a' got the candles, and I reckon they did. I wonder they don't walk off with the whole place, the way you're always going to stop their holes and don't do it. And if they weren't fools, they'd sleep in your hair, Silas. You'd never find it out, but you can't lay the spoon on the rats, and that I know." "Well, Sally, I'm in fault, and I acknowledge it. I've been remiss, but I won't let tomorrow go by without stopping up them holes." "Oh, I wouldn't hurry. Next year'll do. Matilda Angelina Araminta Phelps!" Whack comes the thimble, and the child snatches her claws out of the sugar bowl without fooling around any. Just then the nigger woman steps on to the passage and says, "Missus, dey's a sheet gone." "A sheet gone? Well, for the land's sake!" "I'll stop up them holes today," says Uncle Silas, looking sorrowful. "Oh, do shut up. S'pose the rats took the sheet. Where's it gone, Lize?" "Cly to goodness, I hain't no notion, Miss Sally. She was on de clothesline yisterday, but she done gone. She ain't there no more now." "I reckon the world is coming to an end. I never see the beat of it in all my born days. A shirt and a sheet and a spoon and 6 "Missus," comes a young yaller wench, "dey's a brass candlestick missing." "Clear out from here, you hussy, or I'll take a skillet to ye." Well, she was just a bilin'. I begun to lay for a chance. I reckoned I would sneak out and go for the woods till the weather moderated. She kept a-ragin' right along, running her insurrection all by herself, and everybody else mighty meek and quiet. And at last Uncle Silas, looking kind of foolish, fishes up that spoon out of his pocket. She stopped, with her mouth open and her hands up, and as for me, I wished I was in Jerusalem or somewheres, but not long, because she says, "It's just as I expected. So you had it in your pocket all the time, and like as not you've got the other things there too. How'd it get there?" "I really don't know, Sally," he says, kind of apologizing, "or you know I would tell. I was a-studying over my text in Acts 17 before breakfast, and I reckon I put it in there not noticing, meaning to put my Testament in, and it must be so because my Testament ain't in. But I'll go and see, and if the Testament is where I had it, I'll know I didn't put it in, and that will show that I laid the Testament down and took up the spoon and— Oh, for the land's sake, give a body a rest. Go along now, the whole kit and bilin' of ye, and don't come nigh me again till I've got back my peace of mind." I'd heard her if she'd a said it to herself, let alone speaking it out, and I'd a got up and obeyed her if I'd a been dead. As we was passing through the settin' room, the old man he took up his hat, and the shingle nail fell out on the floor, and he just merely picked it up and laid it on the mantel shelf, and never said nothin', and went out. Tom see him do it, and remembered about the spoon, and says, "Well, it ain't no use to send things by him no more. He ain't reliable." Then he says, "But he done us a good turn with the spoon anyhow, without knowing it, and so we'll go and do him one without him knowing it. Stop up his rat holes." There was a noble good lot of them down cellar, and it took us a whole hour, but we done the job tight and good and ship-shape. Then we heard steps on the stairs, and blowed out our light and hid, and here comes the old man with a candle in one hand and a bundle of stuff in the other, looking as absent-minded as year before last. He went a mooning around, first to one rat hole and then another, till he'd been to them all. Then he stood about 5 minutes, picking tallow drip off of his candle and thinking. Then he turns off slow and dreamy towards the stairs, saying, "Well, for the life of me, I can't remember when I done it. I could show her now that I warn't to blame on account of the rats. But never mind, let it go. I reckon it wouldn't do no good." And so he went on a-mumbling upstairs, and then we left. He was a mighty nice old man, and always is. Tom was a good deal bothered about what to do for a spoon, but he said we'd got to have it, so he took a think. When he had ciphered it out, he told me how we was to do. Then we went and waited around the spoon basket till we see Aunt Sally comin', and then Tom went to counting the spoons and laying them out to one side, and I slid one of them up my sleeve, and Tom says, "Why, Aunt Sally, there ain't but 9 spoons yet." She says, "Go along to your play and don't bother me. I know better. I counted 'em myself." "Well, I've counted them twice, Auntie, and I can't make but 9. She looked out of all patience, but of course she come to count. Anybody would. "I declare to gracious there ain't but 9, she says. "Why, what in the world? Plague take the things, I'll count 'em again." So I slipped back the one I had, and when she got done counting, she says, "Hang the troublesome rubbage, there's 10 now." And she looked huffy and bothered both. But Tom says, "Why, Auntie, I don't think there's 10. "You numbskull, didn't you see me count 'em?" "I know, but—" "Well, I'll count 'em again." So I smouched one, and they come out 9, same as the other time. Well, she was in a tearing way, just a trembling all over, she was so mad. But she counted and counted till she got that addled she'd start to count in a basket for a spoon sometimes, and so 3 times they come out right, and 3 times they come out wrong. Then she grabbed up the basket and slammed it across the house, and knocked the cat galley west, and she said clear out and let her have some peace, and if we came bothering her again betwixt that and dinner, she'd skin us. So we had the odd spoon, and dropped it in her apron pocket while she was a-giving us our sailing orders, and Jim got it all right, along with her shingle nail, before noon. We was very well satisfied with this business, and Tom allowed it was worth twice the trouble it took, because he said now she couldn't ever count them spoons twice alike again to save her life, and wouldn't believe she'd counted them right if she did, and said that after she'd about counted her head off for the next 3 days, he judged she'd give it up and offer to kill anybody that wanted her to ever count them any more. So we put the sheet back on the line that night, and stole one out of her closet, and kept on putting it back and stealing it again for a couple of days, till she didn't know how many sheets she had any more, and she didn't care, and weren't a-going to bullyrag the rest of her soul out about it, and wouldn't count them again not to save her life. She'd druther die first. So we was all right now. As to the shirt and the sheet and the spoon and the candles, by the help of the calf and the rats and the mixed-up counting, and as to the candlestick, it warn't no consequence. It would blow over by and by. But that pie was a job. We had no end of trouble with that pie. We fixed it up away down in the woods and cooked it there, and we got it done at last, and very satisfactory, too, but not all in one day, and we had to use up 3 washpans full of flour before we got through, and we got burnt pretty much all over in places and eyes put out with the smoke, because, you see, we didn't want nothing but a crust, and we couldn't prop it up right, and she would always cave in. But of course we thought of the right way at last, which was to cook the latter, too, in the pie. So then we laid in with Jim the second night, and tore up the sheet all in little strings and twisted them together, and long before daylight we had a lovely rope, that you could 'a' hung a person with. We let on it took 9 months to make it. And in the forenoon we took it down to the woods, but it wouldn't go into the pie. Being made of a whole sheet that way, there was rope enough for 40 pies if we'd 'a' wanted them, and plenty left over for soup or sausage or anything you choose. We could 'a' had a whole dinner. But we didn't need it. All we needed was just enough for the pie, and so we throwed the rest away. We didn't cook none of the pies in the washpan, afraid the solder would melt. But Uncle Silas, he had a noble brass warming pan, which he thought considerable of, because it belonged to one of his ancestors with a long wooden handle that come over from England with William the Conqueror in the Mayflower, or one of them early ships, and was hid away up garret with a lot of other old pots and things that was valuable, not on account of being any account, because they weren't, but on account of them being relics, you know. And we snaked her out private and took her down there, but she failed on the first pies, because we didn't know how. But she come up smiling on the last one. We took and lined her with dough and set her in the coals and loaded her up with rag rope and put on a dough roof and shut down the lid and put hot embers on top and stood off 5 foot with the long handle, cool and comfortable. And in 15 minutes she turned out a pie that was a satisfaction to look at. But the person that ate it would want to fetch a couple of cags of toothpicks along, for if that rope ladder wouldn't cramp him down to business, I don't know nothing what I'm talking about, and lay him in enough stomachache to last him till next time, too. Nat didn't look when we put the witch pie in Jim's pan, and we put the 3 tin plates in the bottom of the pan under the vittles, and so Jim got everything all right, and as soon as he was by himself he busted into the pie and hid the rope ladder inside of his straw tick, and scratched some marks on a tin plate, and throwed it out of the window hole. End of chapter 37. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in July 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 38. Making them pens was a distressed tough job, and so was the saw, and Jim allowed the inscription was going to be the toughest of all. That's the one which the prisoner has to scrabble on the wall. But he had to have it. Tom said he'd got to. There weren't no case of a state prisoner not scrabbling his inscription to leave behind, and his coat of arms. "Look at Lady Jane Grey," he says. "Look at Guilford Dudley. Look at old Northumberland. Why, Huck, suppose it is considerable trouble. What you going to do? How you going to get around it? Jim's got to do his inscription and coat of arms. They all do." Jim says, "Why, Mars Tom, I hain't got no coat of arm. I hain't got nothing but dish yere old shirt, and you knows I got to keep the journal on dat." "Oh, you don't understand, Jim. A coat of arms is very different." "Well," I says, "Jim's right anyway when he says he ain't got no coat of arms, because he hain't." "I reckon I knowed that," Tom says, "but you bet he'll have one before he gets out of this, because he's going out right, and there ain't going to be no flaws in his record." So, whilst me and Jim filed away at the pens on a brickbat apiece, Jim a-making his'n out of the brass and I making mine out of the spoon, Tom set to work to think out the coat of arms. By and by, he said he'd struck so many good ones he didn't hardly know which to take, but there was one which he reckoned he'd decide on. He says, "On the sketchin' we'll have a bend, or in the dexter base, a saltire Murray in the fess with a dog, couchant for common charge, and under his foot a chain embattled for slavery, with a chevron vert and a chief engrailed, and 3 invected lines on a field azure, with the nombral points rampant on a dancet indented, crest, a runaway nigger, sable, with his bundle over his shoulder on a bar sinister, and a couple of ghouls for supporters, which is you and me. Motto, Magiora fretta, minora atto. Got it out of a book. Means the more haste, the less speed." Gee willikins, I says, but what does the rest of it mean? We ain't got no time to bother over that, he says. We got to dig in like all get out. Well, anyway, I says, what's some of it? What's a fess? A fess? A fess is... You don't need to know what a fess is. I'll show him how to make it when he gets to it. Shucks, Tom, I says, I think you might tell a person. What's a bar sinister? Oh, I don't know, but he's got to have it. All the nobility does. That was just his way. If it didn't suit him to explain a thing to you, he wouldn't do it. You might pump at him a week, it wouldn't make no difference. He'd got all that coat of arms business fixed, so now he started in to finish up the rest of that part of the work, which was to plan out a mournful inscription. Said Jim got to have one, like they all done. He made up a lot, and wrote them out on a paper and read them off so. 1. Here a captive heart busted. 2. Here a poor prisoner, forsook by the world and friends, fretted his sorrowful life. 3. Here a lonely heart broke, and a worn spirit went to its rest after 37 years of solitary captivity. 4. Here, homeless and friendless, after 37 years of bitter captivity, perished a noble stranger, natural son of Louis XIV. Tom's voice trembled whilst he was reading them, and he most broke down. When he got done, he couldn't no way make up his mind which one for Jim to scrabble onto the wall, they was all so good, but at last he allowed he would let him scrabble them all on. Jim said it would take him a year to scrabble such a lot of truck onto the logs with a nail, and he didn't know how to make letters besides. But Tom said he would block them out for him, and then he wouldn't have nothing to do but just follow the lines. Then, pretty soon he says, "Come to think, the logs ain't a-going to do. They don't have log walls in a dungeon. We got to dig the inscriptions into a rock. We'll fetch a rock." Jim said the rock was worse than the logs. He said it would take him such a pissin' long time to dig them into a rock he wouldn't ever get out. But Tom said he would let me help him do it. Then he took a look to see how me and Jim was getting along with the pens. It was most pesky tedious hard work and slow, and didn't give my hands no show to get well of the sores, and we didn't seem to make no headway hardly. So Tom says, "I know how to fix it. We got to have a rock for the coat of arms and mournful inscriptions, and we can kill 2 birds with that same rock. There's a gaudy big grindstone down at the mill, and we'll smatch it and carve the things on it and file out the pens and the saw on it too." It warn't no slouch of an idea, and it warn't no slouch of a grindstone nuther, but we'd allowed we'd tackle it. It warn't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the mill, leaving Jim at work. We smouched the grindstone and set out to roll her home, but it was a most nation tough job. Sometimes, do what we couldn't keep her from falling over, and she come mighty near mashing us every time. Tom said she was going to get one of us, sure, before we got through. We got her halfway, and then we was plumb played out, and most drownded with sweat. We see it warn't no use. We got to go and fetch Jim. So he raised up his bed and slid the chain off of the bed leg and wrapped it around and round his neck, and we crawled out through our hole and down there, and Jim and me laid into that grindstone and walked her along like nothing, and Tom superintended. He could out-superintend any boy I ever see. He knowed how to do everything. Our hole was pretty big, but it warn't big enough to get the grindstone through. But Jim, he took the pick and soon made it big enough. Then Tom marked out them things in it with a nail and set Jim to work on them, with the nail for a chisel and an iron bolt from the rubbish in the lean-to for a hammer, and told him to work till the rest of his candle quit on him, and then he could go to bed and hide the grindstone under his straw tick and sleep on it. Then we helped him fix his chain back on the bed leg and was ready for bed ourselves. But Tom thought of something and says, "You got any spiders in here, Jim?" "No, sah, thanks to goodness I hain't, Marse Tom." "All right, we'll get you some." "But bless you, honey, I don't want none. I's afeared on 'em. I just as soon have rattlesnakes around." Tom thought a minute or two and says, "It's a good idea, and I reckon it's been done. It must have been done, it stands to reason. Yes, it's a prime good idea. Where could you keep it?" "Keep what, Mars Tom?" "Why, a rattlesnake." "To goodness gracious alive, Mars Tom! Why, if dey was a rattlesnake to come in here, I'd take and bust right out through dat log wall, I would, with my head." "Why, Jim, you wouldn't be afraid of it after a little. You could tame it." "Tame it?" "Yes, easy enough. Every animal is grateful for kindness and petting, and they wouldn't think of hurting a person that pets them. Any book will tell you that. You try, that's all I ask. Just try for 2 or 3 days. Why, you can get him so in a little while that he'll love you and sleep with you and won't stay away from you a minute, and will let you wrap him round your neck and put his head in your mouth. Please, Mars Tom, don't talk so. I can't stand it. He'd let me shove his head in my mouth for a favor, hain't it? I lay he'd wait a powerful long time 'fore I asked him. And more'n dat, I don't want him to sleep with me." "Jim, don't act so foolish. A prisoner's got to have some kind of a dumb pet, and if a rattlesnake hain't ever been tried, why, there's more glory to be gained in your being the first to ever try it than any other way you could ever think of to save your life." "Why, Mars Tom, I don't want no such glory. Snake take and bite Jim's chin off. Then what is the glory? No, sir, I don't want no such doin's." "Blame it, can't you try? I only want you to try. You needn't keep it up if it don't work." "But the trouble all done if the snake bite me while I's a-tryin' him. Mars Tom, I's willin' to tackle most anything 'at ain't unreasonable, but if you and Huck fetches a rattlesnake in here for me to tame, I's gwine to leave, that's shore." "Well, then, let it go. Let it go if you're so bullheaded about it. We can get you some garter snakes, and you can tie some buttons on their tails and let on the rattlesnakes, and I reckon that'll have to do." "I can stand dem, Mars Tom, but blame if I couldn't get along without 'em, I tell you dat. I never knowed before 'twas so much bother and trouble to be a prisoner." "Well, it always is when it's done right. You got any rats around here?" "No, sah, I hain't seed none." "Well, we'll get you some rats." "Why, Mars Tom, I don't want no rats. Dey's the dad-blamedest creatures disturb a body and rustle round over him and bite his feet when he's trying to sleep I ever see. No, sir, gimme garter snakes if I's got to have 'em, but don't gimme no rats. I hain't got no use for 'em, scasely." "But, Jim, you got to have 'em. They all do. So don't make no more fuss about it. Prisoners ain't ever without rats. There ain't no instance of it. And they train them and pet them and learn them tricks, and they get to be as sociable as flies. But you got to play music to them. You got anything to play music on?" "I ain't got nothing but a coast comb and a piece of paper and a juice harp, but I reckon they wouldn't take no such stock in a juice harp." "Yes, they would. They don't care what kind of music 'tis. A juice harp's plenty good enough for a rat. All animals like music. In a prison they dote on it. Specially painful music, and you can't get no other kind out of a Jew's harp. It always interests them. They come out to see what's the matter with you. Yes, you're all right. You're fixed very well. You want to sit on your bed nights before you go to sleep and early in the mornings and play your Jew's harp. Play 'The Last Link is Broken.' That's the thing that'll scoop a rat quicker'n anything else. When you've played about 2 minutes you'll see all the rats and the snakes and spiders and things begin to feel worried about you and come, and they'll just fairly swarm over you and have a noble good time." "Yes, dey will, I reckon, Mars Tom. But what kinder time is Jim having? Bless if I can see the point. But I'll do it if I got to. I reckon I better keep the animals satisfied and not have no trouble in the house." Tom waited to think it over and see if there warn't nothing else, and pretty soon he says, "Oh, there's one thing I forgot. Could you raise a flower here, do you reckon?" "I don't know, but maybe I could, Mars Tom. But it's tolerable dark in here, and I ain't got no use for no flower, nohow, and she'd be a powerful sight of trouble." "Well, you try it anyway. Some other prisoners has done it." "One of them big cat-tail-looking mullein stalks would grow in here, Mars Tom, I reckon, but she wouldn't be worth half the trouble she'd cost." Don't you believe it. We'll fetch you a little one, and you plant it in the corner over there and raise it. And don't call it mullein, call it pitchiola. That's its right name when it's in a prison. And you want to water it with your tears. Why, I got plenty spring water, Mars Tom. You don't want spring water. You want to water it with your tears. It's the way they always do. Why, Mars Tom, I lay I can raise one of them mullein stalks twice with spring water, whiles another man's a-starting one with tears. That ain't the idea. You got to do it with tears. She'll die on my hands, Mars Tom. She surely will, 'cause I don't scasely ever cry. So Tom was stumped, but he studied it over, and then said Jim would have to worry along the best he could with an onion. He promised he would go to the nigger cabins and drop one, private, in Jim's coffee pot in the morning. Jim said he would just as soon have tobacco in his coffee, and found so much fault with it, and with the work and bother of raising the mullein, and Jews harping the rats, and petting and flattering up the snakes and spiders and things, on top of all the other work he had to do on pens and inscriptions and journals and things, which made it more trouble and worry and responsibility to be a prisoner than anything he ever undertook, that Tom most lost all patience with him, and said he was just loading down with more gaudier chances than a prisoner ever had in the world to make a name for himself, and yet he didn't know enough to appreciate them, and they was just about wasted on him. So Jim, he was sorry, and said he wouldn't behave so no more, and then me and Tom shoved for bed. End of chapter 38. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in July 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 39. In the morning we went up to the village and bought a wire rat trap and fetched it down and unstopped the best rat hole, and in about an hour we had 15 of the bulliest kind of ones, and then we took it and put it in a safe place under Aunt Sally's bed. But while we was gone for spiders, little Thomas Franklin Benjamin Jefferson Alexander Phelps found it there and opened the door of it to see if the rats would come out, and they did, and Aunt Sally she come in, and when we got back she was a-standing on top of the bed, raising Cain, and the rats was doing what they could to keep off the dull times for her. So she took and dusted us both with a hickory, and we was as much as 2 hours catching another 15 or 16, drat that meddlesome cub, and they weren't the likeliest nother, because the first haul was the pick of the flock. I never see a likelier lot of rats than what that first haul was. We got a splendid stock of sorted spiders and bugs and frogs and caterpillars and one thing or another, and we'd like to got a hornet's nest, but we didn't. The family was at home. We didn't give it right up, but stayed with them as long as we could, because we allowed we'd tire them out, or they'd got to tire us out, and they done it. Then we got alicumpain and rubbed on the places and was pretty near all right again, but couldn't set down convenient. And so we went for the snakes, and grabbed a couple of dozen garters and house snakes, and put them in a bag and put it in our room. And by that time it was supper time, and a rattling good honest day's work. And hungry? Oh, no, I reckon not. And there weren't a blessed snake up there when we went back. We didn't half tie the sack, and they worked out somehow and left. But it didn't matter much, because they was still on the premises somewheres. So we judged we could get some of them again. No, there weren't no real scarcity of snakes about the house for a considerable spell. You'd see them dripping from the rafters and places every now and then, and they generally landed in your plate or down the back of your neck, and most of the time where you didn't want them. Well, they was handsome and striped, and there weren't no harm in a million of them, but that never made no difference to Aunt Sally. She despised snakes, be the breed what they might, and she couldn't stand them no way you could fix it. And every time one of them flopped down on her, it didn't make no difference what she was doing. She would just lay that work down and light out. I never see such a woman. and you could hear her whoop to Jericho. You couldn't get her to take a hold of one of them with the tongs, and if she turned over and found one in bed, she would scramble out and lift a howl that you would think the house was afire. She disturbed the old man so that he said he could most wish there hadn't ever been no snakes created. Why, after every last snake had been gone clear out of the house for as much as a week, Aunt Sally warn't over it yet. She warn't near over it. When she was settin' thinking about something, you could touch her on the back of her neck with a feather, and she would jump right out of her stockings. It was very curious. But Tom said all women was just so. He said they was made that way for some reason or other. We got a lickin' every time one of our snakes come in her way, and she allowed these lickin's weren't nothing to what she would do if we ever loaded up the place again with them. I didn't mind the lickin's, because they didn't amount to nothing, but I minded the trouble we had to lay in another lot. But we got them laid in, and all the other things, and you never see a cabin as blithesome as Jim's was when they'd all swarm out for music and go for him. Jim didn't like the spiders, and the spiders didn't like Jim, and so they'd lay for him and make it mighty warm for him. And he said that between the rats and the snakes and the grindstone, there weren't no room in bed for him scasely. When there was, a body couldn't sleep, it was so lively, and it was always lively, he said, because they never all slept at one time, but took turn about, so when the snakes was asleep, the rats was on deck, and when the rats turned in, the snakes come on watch. So he always had one gang under him in his way, and the other gang having a circus over him, and if he got up to hunt a new place, the spiders would take a chance at him as he crossed over. He said if he ever got out this time, he wouldn't ever be a prisoner again, not for a salary. Well, by the end of 3 weeks, everything was in pretty good shape. The shirt was sent in early, in a pie, and every time a rat bit Jim, he would get up and write a little in his journal, whilst the ink was fresh. The pens was made, the inscriptions and so on was all carved on the grindstone, the bed leg was sawed in two, and we had et up the sawdust, and it give us a most amazing stomach ache. We reckoned we was all going to die, but didn't. It was the most undigestible sawdust I ever see, and Tom said the same. But, as I was saying, we got all the work done now at last, and we was all pretty much fagged out, too, but mainly Jim. The old man had wrote a couple of times to the plantation below Orleans to come and get their runaway nigger, but hadn't got no answer, because there weren't no such plantation. So he allowed he would advertise Jim in the St. Louis and New Orleans papers, and when he mentioned the St. Louis ones, it give me the cold shivers, and I see we hadn't no time to lose. So Tom said, now for the anonymous letters. What's them? I says. Warnings to the people that something is up. Sometimes it's done one way, sometimes another, but there's always somebody spying around that gives notice to the governor of the castle. When Louis XVI was going to light out of the Tuileries, a servant girl done it. It's a very good way, and so is the anonymous letters. We'll use them both, and it's usual for the prisoner's mother to change clothes with him, and she stays in, and he slides out in her clothes. We'll do that, too. But look-a-here, Tom, what do we want to warn anybody for that something's up? Let them find it out for themselves. It's their lookout. Yes, I know, but you can't depend on them. It's the way they've acted from the very start, left us to do everything. They're so confiding and mullet-headed, they don't take notice of nothing at all. So if we don't give them notice, there won't be nobody nor nothing to interfere with us, and so after all our hard work and trouble, this escape will go off perfectly flat. Won't amount to nothing. Won't be nothing to it. Well, as for me, Tom, that's the way I'd like. Shucks, he says, and looked disgusted. So I says, but I ain't going to make no complaint. Any way that suits you suits me. What you going to do about the servant girl? You'll be her. You slide in the middle of the night and hook that yaller girl's frock. Why, Tom, that'll make trouble next morning, because of course you probably hain't got any but that one. I know, but you don't want it but 15 minutes to carry the anonymous letter and shove it under the front door. All right, then, I'll do it, but I could carry it just as handy in my own togs. You wouldn't look like a servant girl then, would you? No, but there won't be nobody to see what I look like anyway. That ain't got nothing to do with it. The thing for us to do is just to do our duty, and not worry about whether anybody sees us do it or not. Hain't you got no principle at all?" "All right, I ain't saying nothing. I'm the servant girl. Who's Jim's mother?" "I'm his mother. I'll hook a gown from Aunt Sally." "Well, then, you'll have to stay in the cabin when me and Jim leaves." "Not much. I'll stuff Jim's clothes full of straw and lay it on his bed to represent his mother in disguise, and Jim will take the nigger woman's gown off of me and wear it, and we'll all evade together. When a prisoner of style escapes, it's called an evasion. It's always called so when a king escapes, for instance. And the same with a king's son. It don't make no difference whether he's a natural one or an unnatural one. So Tom, he wrote the anonymous letter, and I smouched the yaller wench's frock that night and put it on and shoved it under the front door the way Tom told me to. It said, 'Beware. Trouble is brewin'. Keep a sharp lookout. Unknown friend.' Next night we stuck a picture, which Tom drawed in blood, of a skull and crossbones on the front door, and next night another one of a coffin on the back door. I never see a family in such a sweat. They couldn't have been worse scared if the place had been full of ghosts laying for them behind everything and under the beds and shivering through the air. If a door banged, Aunt Sally, she jumped and said, 'Ouch,' if anything fell. She jumped and said, 'Ouch,' if you happened to touch her. When she weren't noticing, she done the same. She couldn't face Snow Way and be satisfied, 'cause she allowed there was something behind her every time, so she was always a-whirling around sudden and saying, 'Ouch,' and before she got 2/3 around she'd whirl back again and say it again, and she was afraid to go to bed, but she dasn't set up. So the thing was working very well, Tom said. He said he never seen anything work more satisfactory. He said it showed it was done right. So he said, 'Now for the grand bulge.' So the very next morning at the streak of dawn we got another letter ready and was wondering what we better do with it, because we heard them say at supper they was going to have a nigger on watch at both doors all night. Tom, he went down the lightning rod to spy around, and the nigger at the back door was asleep, and he stuck it in the back of his neck and come back. This letter said, 'Don't betray me. I wish to be your friend. There's a desperate gang of cutthroats from over in the Indian Territory going to steal your runaway nigger tonight, and they have been trying to scare you so as you will stay in the house and not bother them. I am one of the gang, but have got religion and wish to quit it and lead an honest life again, and will betray the hellish design. They will sneak down from northards along the fence at midnight exact with a false key and go in the nigger's cabin to get him. I am to be off a piece and blow a tin horn if I see any danger, but stead of that I will baa like a sheep as soon as they get in, and not blow at all. Then whilst they are getting his chains loose, you slip there and lock them in, and can kill them at your leisure. Don't do anything but just the way I am telling you. If you do, they will suspicion something, and raise whoop jamboree hoo. I do not wish any reward, but to know I have done the right thing. Unknown friend. End of chapter 39. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in July 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 40. We was feeling pretty good after breakfast, and took the canoe and went over the river a-fishin' with a lunch, and had a good time, and took a look at the raft and found her all right, and got home late to supper, and found them in such a sweat and worry they didn't know which end they was standing on, and made us go right off to bed the minute we was done supper, and wouldn't tell us what the trouble was, and never let on a word about the new letter, but didn't need to because we knowed as much about it as anybody did. And as soon as we was half upstairs and her back was turned, we slid for the cellar cupboard and loaded up a good lunch and took it up to our room and went to bed and got up about 11:30, and Tom put on Aunt Sally's dress that he stole and was going to start with the lunch, but says, "Where's the butter?" "I laid out a hunk of it," I says, "on a piece of a corn pone." "Well, you left it laid out then. It ain't here." "We can get along without it," I says. "We can get along with it, too," he says. "Just you slide down cellar and fetch it, and then mosey right down the lightning rod and come along. I'll go and stuff the straw into Jim's clothes to represent his mother in disguise, and be ready to baa like a sheep and shove soon as you get there." So out he went, and down cellar went I. The hunk of butter, big as a person's fist, was where I had left it, so I took up the slab of corn pone with it on, and blowed out my light, and started upstairs very stealthy, and got up to the main floor all right, but here comes Aunt Sally with a candle, and I clapped the truck in my hat, and clapped my hat on my head, and the next second she see me, and she says, "You been down cellar?" "Yes'm." "What you been doing down there?" "Nothin'." "Nothin'?" "No'm." "Well, then what possessed you to go down there this time of night?" "I don't know'm." "You don't know? Don't answer me that way, Tom. I want to know what you been doing down there." "I ain't been doing a single thing, Aunt Sally. I hope to gracious if I have." I reckoned she'd let me go now, and as a general thing she would, but I suppose there were so many strange things going on she was just in a sweat about every little thing that warn't yardstick straight, so she says, very decided, "You just march into that settin' room and stay there till I come. You been up to something you no business to, and I lay I'll find out what it is before I'm done with you." So she went away as I opened the door and walked into the settin' room. My, but there was a crowd there. 15 farmers, and every one of them had a gun. I was most powerful sick, and slunk to a chair and set down. They was sittin' around, some of them talking a little, in a low voice, and all of them fidgety and uneasy, but trying to look like they warn't, but I knowed they was, because they was always taking off their hats and putting them on and scratching their heads and changing their seats and fumbling with their buttons. I warn't easy myself, but I didn't take my hat off all the same. I did wish Aunt Sally would come and get done with me and lick me if she wanted to, and let me get away and tell Tom how we'd overdone this thing and what a thunderin' hornet's nest we'd got ourselves into, so we could stop fooling around straight off and clear out with Jim before these rips got out of patience and come for us. At last she come and begun to ask me questions, but I couldn't answer them straight. I didn't know which end of me was up, because these men was in such a fidget now that some of them was wanting to start right now and lay for them desperadoes, and saying it warn't but a few minutes to midnight, and others was trying to get them to hold on and wait for the sheep signal, and here was Auntie pegging away at the questions, and me a shaking all over and ready to sink down in my tracks, I was that scared, and the place getting hotter and hotter, and the butter beginning to melt and run down my neck and behind my ears, and pretty soon when one of them says, "I'm for going and getting in the cabin first, and right now, and catching them when they come," I most dropped, and a streak of butter come a-trickling down my forehead, and Aunt Sally she sees it, and turns white as a sheet, and says, "For the land's sake, what is the matter with the child? He's got the brain fever as sure as you're born, and they're oozing out." And everybody runs to see, and she snatches off my hat, and out comes the bread and what was left of the butter, and she grabbed me and hugged me and says, "Oh, what a turn you did give me, and how glad and grateful I am it ain't no worse, for luck's against us, and it never rains but it pours, and when I see that truck I thought we'd lost you, for I knowed by the color and all it was just like your brains would be if— Dear, why didn't you tell me that was what you'd been down there for? I wouldn't have cared. Now clear out to bed and don't let me see no more of you till morning." I was upstairs in a second, and down the lightning rod in another one, and shinning through the dark for the lean-to. I couldn't hardly get my words out, I was so anxious, but I told Tom as quick as I could we must jump for it now, and not a minute to lose, the house full of men yonder, with guns. His eyes just blazed, and he says, "No, is that so? Ain't it bully? Why, Huck, if I was to do it over again, I bet I could fetch 200. If we could put it off till—" "Hurry, hurry," I says. "Where's Jim?" "Right at your elbow. If you reach out your arm, you can touch him. He's dressed and everything's ready. Now we'll slide out and give the sheep signal." But then we heard the tramp of men come into the door, and heard them begin to fumble with the padlock, and heard a man say,
I told you we'd be too soon. They haven't come. The door's locked. Here, I'll lock some of you into the cabin, and you lay for 'em in the dark, and kill 'em when they come, and the rest scatter round a piece and listen if you can hear 'em comin'. So in they come, but couldn't see us in the dark, and most tried on us whilst we was hustlin' to get under the bed. But we got under all right and out through the hole, swift but soft. Jim first, me next, and Tom last, which was according to Tom's orders. Now we was in the lean-to, and heard trampin's close by outside, so we crept to the door, and Tom stopped us there and put his eye to the crack, but couldn't make out nothin', it was so dark, and whispered and said he would listen for the steps to get further, and when he nudged us Jim must slide out first and him last. So he set his ear to the crack and listened and listened and listened, and the steps a-scraping around out there all the time, and at last he nudged us, and we slid out and stooped down, not breathing and not making the least noise, and slipped stealthy towards the fence in Injun file and got to it all right, and me and Jim over it, but Tom's britches catched fast on a splinter on the top rail, and then he hear the steps comin', so he had to pull loose, which snapped the splinter and made a noise, and as he dropped in our tracks and started, somebody sings out, "Who's that? Answer or I'll shoot." But we didn't answer. We just unfurled our heels and shoved. Then there was a rush and a bang, 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 and the bullets fairly whizzed around us. We heard them sing out, "Here they are! They broke for the river! After 'em, boys, and turn loose the dogs!" So here they come, full tilt. We could hear them because they wore boots and yelled, but we didn't wear no boots and didn't yell. We was in the path to the mill, and when they got pretty close on to us we dodged into the bush and let them go by, and then dropped in behind them. They'd had all the dogs shut up so they wouldn't scare off the robbers. By this time somebody had let them loose, and here they come, making pow-wow enough for 1,000,000. But they was our dogs, so we stopped in our tracks till they ketched up, and when they see it warn't nobody but us, and no excitement to offer them, they only just said howdy, and tore right ahead towards the shouting and clattering, and then we up steam again, and whizzed along after them till we was nearly to the mill, and then struck up through the bush to where my canoe was tied, and hopped in and pulled for dear life towards the middle of the river, but didn't make no more noise than we was obleeged to. Then we struck out, easy and comfortable, for the island where my raft was, and we could hear them yelling and barking at each other all up and down the bank till we was so far away the sounds got dim and died out, and when we stepped onto the raft I says, "Now, old Jim, you're a free man again, and I bet you won't ever be a slave no more." And a mighty good job it was, too, Huck. It is planned beautiful, and it is done beautiful, and they ain't nobody can get up a plan that's more mixed up and splendid than what that one was. We was all glad as we could be, but Tom was the gladdest of all, because he had a bullet in the calf of his leg. When me and Jim heard that, we didn't feel so brash as what we did before. It was hurting him considerable and bleeding, so we laid him in the wigwam and tore up one of the Duke's shirts for to bandage him. But he says, "Gimme the rags. I can do it myself. Don't stop now. Don't fool around here. And the evasion booming along so handsome. Man the sweeps and set her loose. Boys, we done it elegant. 'Deed we did. I wish we'd 'a' had the handling of Louis 16. There wouldn't been a no son of St. Louis ascend to heaven, wrote down in his biography. No, sir, we'd 'a' whooped him over the border. That's what we'd 'a' done with him, and done it just as slick as nothing at all, too. Man the sweeps! Man the sweeps!" But me and Jim was consulting and thinking, and after we'd thought a minute I says, "Say it, Jim." So he says, "Well, then this is the way it looked to me, Huck. If it was him that is being set free, one of the boys was to get shot, would he say, 'Go on and save me, never mind by the doctor for to save this one'? Is dat like Mars Tom Sawyer? Would he say dat? You bet he wouldn't. Well, then is Jim gwine to say it? No, suh. I don't budge a step out'n dis place dout a doctor, not if it's 40 year." I knowed he was white inside, and I reckoned he'd say what he did say, so it was all right now, and I told Tom I was a-goin' for a doctor. He raised considerable row about it, but me and Jim stuck to it and wouldn't budge,
So he was for crawling out and setting the raft loose himself, but we wouldn't let him. Then he gives us a piece of his mind, but it didn't do no good. So when he sees me getting the canoe ready, he says, "Well, then, if you're bound to go, I'll tell you the way to do when you get to the village. Shut the door and blindfold the doctor tight and fast, and make him swear to be silent as the grave, and put a purse full of gold in his hand, and then take and lead him all around the back alleys and everywheres in the dark, and then fetch him here in the canoe in a roundabout way amongst the islands, and search him and take his chalk away from him, and don't give it back to him until you get him back to the village, or else he will chalk this raft so he can find it again. It's the way they all do." So I said I would, and left, and Jim was to hide in the woods when he sees the doctor coming till he was gone again. End of chapter 40. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in July 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 41. The doctor was an old man, a very nice, kind-looking old man when I got him up. I told him me and my brother was over on Spanish Island hunting yesterday afternoon, and camped on a piece of raft we found. About midnight he must have kicked his gun in his dreams, for it went off and shot him in the leg, and we wanted him to go over there and fix it and not say nothing about it, nor let nobody know, because we wanted to come home this evening and surprise the folks. "Who is your folks?" he says. "The Phelpses, down yonder." "Oh," he says, and after a minute he says, "How'd you say he got shot?" "He had a dream," I says, "and it shot him." "Singular dream," he says. So he lit up his lantern and got his saddlebags and we started, but when he sees the canoe he didn't like the look of her, said she was big enough for one but didn't look pretty safe for two. I says, "Oh, you needn't be afeard, sir. She carried the three of us easy enough." "What three?" "Why, me and Sid and the guns. That's what I mean." "Oh," he says. But he put his foot on the gunwale and rocked her and shook his head and said he reckoned he'd look round for a bigger one, but they was all locked and chained. So he took my canoe and said for me to wait till he come back, or I could hunt around further, or maybe I better go down home and get them ready for the surprise if I wanted to. But I said I didn't, so I told him just how to find the raft, and then he started. I struck an idea pretty soon. I says to myself, "S'posen he can't fix that leg just in 3 shakes of a sheep's tail, as the sayin' is. S'posen it takes him 3 or 4 days. What are we going to do, lay around there till he lets the cat out of the bag? No, sir, I know what I'll do. I'll wait. When he comes back, if he says he's got to go any more, I'll get down there too, if I swim, and we'll take and tie him and keep him and shove out down the river, and when Tom's done with him, we'll give him what it's worth, or all we got, and then let him get ashore." So then I crept into a lumber pile to get some sleep, and next time I waked up the sun was away up over my head. I shot out and went for the doctor's house, but they told me he'd gone away in the night sometime or other and warn't back yet. Well, thinks I, that looks powerful bad for Tom, and I'll dig out for the island right off. So away I shoved, and turned the corner, and nearly rammed my head into Uncle Silas's stomach. He says, "Why, Tom, where you been all this time, you rascal?" "I hain't been nowheres," I says, "only just hunting for the runaway nigger, me and Sid." "Why, wherever did you go?" he says. "Your auntie's been mighty uneasy." "She needn't," I says, "because we was all right. We followed the men and the dogs, but they outrun us and we lost them, but we thought we heard them on the water, so we got a canoe and took out after them and crossed over, but couldn't find nothing of them, so we cruised along up shore till we got kind of tired and beat out, and tied up the canoe and went to sleep and never waked up till about an hour ago. Then we paddled over here to hear the news, and Sid's at the post office to see what he can hear, and I'm a-branching out to get something to eat for us, and then we're going home." So then we went to the post office to get Sid, but just as I suspicioned he weren't there.
So the old man he got a letter out of the office, and we waited a while longer, but Sid didn't come. So the old man said, come along, let Sid foot it home, or canoe it, when he got done fooling around, but we would ride. I couldn't get him to let me stay and wait for Sid, and he said there warn't no use in it, and I must come along, and let Aunt Sally see we was all right. When we got home, Aunt Sally was that glad to see me she laughed and cried both, and hugged me and give me one of them lickings of hern that don't amount to shucks, and said she'd serve Sid the same when he come. And the place was plumb full of farmers and farmers' wives to dinner, and such another clack a body never heard. Old Mrs. Hotchkiss was the worst. Her tongue was a-going all the time. She says, well, Sister Phelps, I've ransacked that 'ere cabin over, and I believe the nigger was crazy. I says to Sister Damrell, didn't I, Sister Damrell? Says I, he's crazy, says I. Them's the very words I said. You all hearin' me. He's crazy, says I. Everything shows it, says I. Look at that 'ere grindstone, says I. Want to tell me to any creature in his right mind's going to scrabble all them crazy things onto a grindstone, says I? Here such and person busted his heart, and here and so pegged along for 37 year, and all that. Natural son of Lewis, somebody, and such everlasting rubbish. He's plumb crazy, says I. That's what I says in the first place. It's what I says in the middle, and it's what I says last and all the time. The nigger's crazy. Crazy's Nebuchadnezzar, says I. And look at that 'ere ladder, made out in rags, Sister Hotchkiss, said old Mrs. Damrell. What in the name of goodness could he ever want of? The very words I was a-saying no longer in this minute to Sister Utterback, and she'll tell you so herself. Says she, look at that 'ere rag ladder, says she, and says I, yes, look at it, says I. What could he have wanted of it, says I? She, Sister Hotchkiss, she. But how in the nation they'd ever get that grindstone in there, anyway? And who dug that 'ere hole? And who? My very words, Brer Penrod, I was a-sayin', pass that 'ere sasser and molasses, won't ye? I was a-sayin' to Sister Dunlap just this minute, how did they get that grindstone in there, says I? Without help, mind you, without help. That's where 'tis. Don't tell me, says I. There was help, says I, and there was a plenty help too, says I. There's been a dozen of helping that nigger, and I laid I'd skin every last nigger on this place, but I'd find out who done it, says I, and moreover, says I. A dozen, says you. 40 couldn't have done everything that's been done. Look at them case-knife saws and things, how tedious they've been made. Look at that bed leg sawed off with them. A week's work for 6 men. Look at that nigger made out in straw on the bed, and look at... You may well say, Brer Hightower, it's just as I was saying to Brer Phelps his own self. Says he, what do you think of it, Sister Hotchkiss, says he? Think of what, Brer Phelps, says I? Think of that bed leg sawed off that-a-way, says he. Think of it, says I. I lay I never sawed itself off, says I. Somebody sawed it, says I. That's my opinion, take it or leave it. It mayn't be no count, says I, but such as it is, it's my opinion, says I. And if anybody can start a better one, says I, let him do it, says I, that's all. I says to Sister Dunlap, says I, well, dog my cats. They must have been a house full of niggers in there every night for 4 weeks to have done all that work, Sister Phelps. Look at that shirt. Every last inch of it covered over with secret African writing done with blood. Must have been a raft of 'em at it right along, all the time a'most. Why, I'd give $2 to have it read to me. And as for the niggers that wrote it, I allow I'd take and lash 'em till... People to help him, Brother Marples? Well, I reckon you'd think so if you'd been in this house for a while back. Why, they've stole everything they could lay their hands on, and we a-watching all the time, mind you. They stole that shirt right off of the line. And as for that sheet they made the rag ladder out of, there ain't no telling how many times they didn't steal that. And flour and candles and candlesticks and spoons and the old warming pan and most 1,000 things that I disremember now. And my new calico dress. And me and Silas and my Sid and Tom on the constant watch, day and night, as I was a-telling you, and not a one of us could catch hide nor hair, nor sight nor sound of them. And here at the last minute, lo and behold you, they slides right in under our noses and fools us. Not only fools us, but the Injun Territory robbers, too, and actually gets away with that nigger safe and sound, and with that 16 men and 22 dogs right on their very heels at that very time. I tell you, it just bangs anything I ever heard of. Why, spirits couldn't have done it better and been no smarter, and I reckon they must have been spirits, because you know our dogs, and there ain't no better. Well, them dogs never even got on the track of 'em once. You explain that to me if you can. any of you."
"Well, it does beat."
"Laws alive, I never—"
"So help me, I wouldn't be—"
"House thieves as well as—" "Goodness gracious sakes, I'd have been afeard to live in such a—" "'Fraid to live! Why, I was that scared I dasn't hardly go to bed, or get up, or lay down, or set down, Sister Ridgway. Why, they'd steal the very—why, goodness sakes, you can guess what kind of a fluster I was in by the time midnight come last night. I hope to gracious if I weren't afraid they'd steal some of the family. I was just to that pass I didn't have no reasoning faculties no more. It looks foolish enough now in the daytime, but I says to myself, there's my 2 poor boys asleep way upstairs in that lonesome room, and I declare to goodness I was that uneasy that I crept up there and locked 'em in, I did. And anybody would, because, you know, when you get scared that way, and it keeps running on and getting worse and worse all the time, and your wits get to addling, and you get to doing all sorts of wild things, and by you think to yourself, supposing I was a boy and was away up here and the door ain't locked and you—" She stopped, looking kind of wondering, and then she turned her head around slow. When her eye lit on me, I got up and took a walk. Says I to myself, I can explain better how we come to not be in that room this morning if I go out to one side and study over it a little. So I done it, but I dasn't go fur, or she'd 'a' sent for me. And when it was late in the day, the people all went. And then I come in and told her the noise and shooting waked up me and Sid, and the door was locked, and we wanted to see the fun, so we went down the lightning rod, and both of us got hurt a little, and we didn't never want to try that no more. And then I went on and told her all what I told Uncle Silas before. And then she said she'd forgive us, and maybe it was all right enough anyway, and about what a body might expect of boys, for all boys was a pretty harum-scarum lot as fur as she could see. And so, as long as no harm hadn't come of it, she judged she better put in her time being grateful we was alive and well, and she had us still, 'stead of fretting over what was past and done. So then she kissed me and patted me on the head and dropped into a kind of a brown study, and pretty soon jumps up and says, "Why, laws a mercy, it's most night and Sid's not come yet. What has become of that boy?" I see my chance, so I skips up and says, "I'll run right up to town and get him," I says. "No, you won't," she says. "You'll stay right where you are. One's enough to be lost at a time. If he ain't here to supper, your uncle'll go." Well, he weren't there to supper, so right after supper Uncle went. He come back about 10, a little bit uneasy, hadn't run across Tom's tracks. Aunt Sally was a good deal uneasy, but Uncle Silas, he said there warn't no occasion to be. Boys will be boys, he said, and you'll see this one turn up in the morning all sound and right. So she had to be satisfied, but she said she'd set up for him a while anyway and keep a light burning so he could see it. And then when I went to bed she come up with me and fetched her candle and tucked me in and mothered me so good I felt mean, and like I couldn't look her in the face. And she set down on the bed and talked with me a long time, and said what a splendid boy Sid was, and didn't seem to want to ever stop talking about him, and kept asking me every now and then if I reckoned he could 'a' got lost or hurt, or maybe drownded, and might be layin' at this minute somewhere sufferin' or dead, and she not by him to help him. And so the tears would drip down silent, and I would tell her that Sid was all right and would be home in the morning, sure. And she would squeeze my hand or maybe kiss me and tell me to say it again and keep on saying it, because it done her good and she was in so much trouble. And when she was going away she looked down in my eyes so steady and gentle and says, "The door ain't going to be locked, Tom, and there's the window and the rod, but you'll be good, won't you? And you won't go? For my sake." Laws knows, I wanted to go bad enough to see about Tom, and was all intending to go, but after that I wouldn't 'a' went, not for kingdoms. But she was on my mind, and Tom was on my mind, so I slept very restless, and twice I went down the right way in the night and slipped around front and see her settin' there by her candle in the window, with her eyes towards the road and the tears in them, and I wished I could do something for her, but I couldn't.
only to swear that I wouldn't never do nothing to grieve her any more. And the third time I waked up at dawn and slid down, and she was there yet, and her candle was most out, and her old gray head was resting on her hand, and she was asleep. End of chapter 41. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in July 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 42. The old man was uptown again before breakfast, but couldn't get no track of Tom, and both of them set at the table thinking, and not saying nothing, and looking mournful, and their coffee getting cold, and not eating anything. And by the old man says, "Did I give you the letter?" "What letter?" "The one I got yesterday out of the post office." "No, you didn't give me no letter." "Well, I must have forgot it." So he rummaged his pockets, and then went off somewheres where he had laid it down, and fetched it and give it to her. She says, "Why, it's from St. Petersburg. It's from Sis." I allowed another walk would do me good, but I couldn't stir. But before she could break it open, she dropped it and run, for she see something, and so do I. It was Tom Sawyer on a mattress, and that old doctor, and Jim, in her calico dress, with his hands tied behind him, and a lot of people. I hid the letter behind the first thing that come handy, and rushed. She flung herself at Tom, crying, and says, "Oh, he's dead, I know he's dead." And Tom, he turned his head a little, and muttered something or other which showed he warn't in his right mind. Then she flung up her hands and says, "He's alive, thank God, and that's enough." And she snatched a kiss of him, and flew for the house to get the bed ready, and scattering orders right and left at the niggers and everybody else, as fast as her tongue could go, every jump of the way. I followed the men to see what they was going to do with Jim, and the old doctor and Uncle Silas followed after Tom into the house. The men was very huffy, and some of them wanted to hang Jim for an example to all the other niggers round there, so they wouldn't be trying to run away like Jim done, and making such a raft of trouble, and keeping a whole family scared most to death for days and nights. But the others said don't do it. It wouldn't answer at all. He ain't our nigger, and his owner would turn up and make us pay for him, sure. So that cooled them down a little, because the people that's always the most anxious for to hang a nigger that hain't done just right is always the very ones that hain't the most anxious to pay for him when they've got their satisfaction out of him. They cussed Jim considerable, though, and give him a cuff or two side of the head once in a while. But Jim, he never said nothing, and he never let on to know me, and they took him to the same cabin and put his own clothes on him and chained him again, and not to no bed leg this time, but to a big staple, drove into the bottom log, and chained his hands, too, and both legs, and said he warn't to have nothing but bread and water to eat after this till his owner come, or he was sold at auction, 'cause he didn't come in a certain length of time, and filled up our hole, and said a couple of farmers with guns must stand watch around about the cabin every night, and a bulldog tied to the door in the daytime. And about this time they was through with the job, and was tapering off with a kind of a general good-bye cussin'. And then the old doctor comes and takes a look, and says, "Don't be no rougher on him than you're obleeged to, because he ain't a bad nigger. When I got to where I found the boy, I see I couldn't cut the bullet out without some help, and he warn't in no condition for me to leave to go and get help, and he got a little worse, and a little worse, and after a long time he went out of his head and wouldn't let me come anigh him any more, and said if I chalked his raft he'd kill me, and no end of wild foolishness like that. And I see I couldn't do anything at all with him, so I says I got to have help somehow. And the minute I says it, out crawls this nigger from somewheres and says he'll help, and he done it too, and done it very well. Of course I judged he must be a runaway nigger, and there I was.
and there I had to stick right straight along all the rest of the day and all night. It was a fix, I tell you. I had a couple of patients with the chills, and of course I'd like to run up to town and see them, but I dasn't, because the nigger might get away, and then I'd be to blame. And yet never a skiff come close enough for me to hail. So there I had to stick plumb till daylight this morning, and I never see a nigger that was a better nurse or more faithfuler, and yet he was risking his freedom to do it, and was all tired out, too. And I see plain enough he'd been worked main hard lately. I liked the nigger for that, I tell you, gentlemen. A nigger like that is worth $1,000, and kind treatment, too. I had everything I needed, and the boy was doing as well there as he would have done at home. Better, maybe, because it was so quiet. But there I was, with both of 'em on my hands, and there I had to stick till about dawn this morning. Then some men in a skiff come by, and as good luck would have it, the nigger was settin' by the pallet with his head propped on his knee sound asleep. So I motioned them in quiet, and they slipped up on him and grabbed him and tied him before he knowed what he was about, and we never had no trouble. And the boy, being in a kind of a flighty sleep, too, we muffled the oars and hitched the raft on and towed her over real nice and quiet, and the nigger never made the least row nor said a word from the start. He ain't no bad nigger, gentlemen. That's what I think about him. Somebody says, "Well, it sounds very good, doctor, I'm obleeged to say." Then the other softened up a little, too, and I was mighty thankful to that old doctor for doing Jim that good turn, and I was glad it was according to my judgment of him, too, because I thought he had a good heart in him, and was a good man the first time I see him. Then they all agreed that Jim had acted very well, and was deserving to have some notice took of it and reward, so every one of them promised right out and hearty that they wouldn't cuss him no more. Then they come out and locked him up. I hoped they was going to say he could have one or two of the chains took off, because they was rotten heavy, or could have meat and greens with his bread and water, but they didn't think of it, and I reckoned it warn't best for me to mix in. But I judged I'd get the doctor's yarn to Aunt Sally somehow or other, as soon as I'd got through the breakers that was laying just ahead of me. Explanations, I mean, of how I forgot to mention about Sid being shot, when I was telling how him and me put in that dratted night paddling around, hunting the runaway nigger. But I had plenty time. Aunt Sally, she stuck to the sick room all day and all night, and every time I see Uncle Silas mooning around, I dodged him. Next morning, I heard Tom was a good deal better, and they said Aunt Sally was gone to get a nap. So I slips to the sick room, and if I found him awake, I reckon we could put up a yarn for the family that would wash. But he was sleeping, and sleeping very peaceful, too, and pale, not fire-faced the way he was when he come. So I set down and laid for him to wake. In about half an hour Aunt Sally comes gliding in, and there I was, up a stump again. She motioned me to be still, and set down by me, and begun to whisper, and said we could all be joyful now, because all the symptoms was first-rate, and he'd been sleeping like that for ever so long, and looking better and peacefuller all the time, and 10 to 1 he'd wake up in his right mind. So we set there watching, and by he stirs a bit, and opened his eyes very natural, and takes a look and says, "Hello, why, I'm at home. How's that? Where's the raft?" "It's all right," I says. "And Jim?" "The same," I says, but couldn't say it pretty brash. But he never noticed, but says, "Good, splendid. Now we're all right and safe. Did you tell Auntie?" I was going to say yes, but she chipped in and says, "About what, Sid?" "Why, about the way the whole thing was done." "What whole thing?" "Why, the whole thing. There ain't but one. How we set the runaway nigger free, me and Tom." "Good land! Set the run— What is the child talking about? Dear, dear, out of his head again." "No, I ain't out of my head. I know all what I'm talking about. We did set him free, me and Tom. We laid out to do it, and we done it. And we done it elegant, too. He'd got a start, and she never checked him up, just set and stared and let him clip along, and I see it warn't no use for me to put in. Why, Auntie, it cost us a power of work, weeks of it. hours and hours every night whilst you was all asleep, and we had to steal candles and the sheet and the shirt and your dress and spoons and tin plates and case knives and the warming pan and the grindstone and flour and just no end of things. And you can't think what work it was to make the saws and pens and inscriptions and one thing or another, and you can't think half the fun it was. And we had to make up the pictures of coffins and things, and anonymous letters from the robbers, and get up and down the lightning rod and dig the hole into the cabin, and made the rope ladder, and send it in cooked up in a pie, and send in spoons and things to work with in your apron pocket. Mercy sakes! And load up the cabin with rats and snakes and so on for company for Jim. And then you kept Tom here so long with the butter in his hat that you come near spilin' the whole business, because the men come before we was out of the cabin and we had to rush, and they heard us and let drive at us, and I got my share, and we dodged out of the path and let them go by. And when the dogs come they weren't interested in us, but went for the most noise, and we got our canoe and made for the raft, and was all safe, and Jim was a free man, and we done it all by ourselves, and wasn't it bully, Auntie? Well, I never heard the likes of it in all my born days. So it was you little rapscallions, that's been making all this trouble, and turned everybody's wits clean inside out, and scared us all most to death. I've as good a notion as ever I had in my life to take it out of you this very minute. To think, here I've been, night after night, you just get well once, you young scamp, and I lay all tan the old Harry out of both of ye. But Tom, he was so proud and joyful, he just couldn't hold in, and his tongue just went it, she a-chipping in and spitting fire all along, and both of them going it at once, like a cat convention. And she says, "Well, you get all the enjoyment you can out of it now, for mind, I tell you, if I catch you meddling with him again—" "Meddling with who?" Tom says, dropping his smile and looking surprised. "With who? Why, the runaway nigger, of course. Who'd you reckon?" Tom looks at me very grave and says, "Tom, didn't you just tell me he was all right? Hasn't he got away?" "Him?" says Aunt Sally. "The runaway nigger? 'Deed he hasn't. They've got him back safe and sound, and he's in that cabin again, on bread and water and loaded down with chains till he's claimed or sold." Tom rose square up in bed with his eye hot and his nostrils opening and shutting like gills, and sings out to me, "They ain't no right to shut him up. Shove, and don't you lose a minute. Turn him loose. He ain't no slave. He's free as any creature that walks this earth." "What does the child mean?" "I mean every word I say, Aunt Sally, and if somebody don't go, I'll go. I've knowed him all his life, and so has Tom there. Old Miss Watson died 2 months ago, and she was ashamed she ever was going to sell him down the river, and said so, and she set him free in her will." "Then what on earth did you want to set him free for, seeing he was already free?" "Well, that is a question, I must say, and just like women. Why, I wanted the adventure of it, and I'd have waded neck-deep in blood to— Goodness alive! Aunt Polly!" If she weren't standing right there, just inside the door, looking as sweet and contented as an angel half full of pie, I wish I may never. Aunt Sally jumped for her and most hugged the head off of her and cried over her, and I found a good enough place for me under the bed, for it was getting pretty sultry for us, seemed to me. And I peeped out, and in a little while Tom's Aunt Polly shook herself loose and stood there, looking across at Tom over her spectacles, kind of grinding him into the earth, you know. And then she says, "Yes, you better turn your head away. I would if I was you, Tom." "Oh, dearie me," says Aunt Sally. "Is he changed so? Why, that ain't Tom, it's Sid. Why, where is Tom? He was here a minute ago." "You mean where's Huck Finn, that's what you mean. I reckon I hain't raised such a scamp as my Tom all these years not to know him when I see him. That would be a pretty howdy-do. Come out from under that bed, Huck Finn." So I done it, but not feeling brash. Aunt Sally, she was one of the mixed-uppest-looking persons I ever see, except one, and that was Uncle Silas when he come in and they told it all to him. It kind of made him drunk, as you may say, and he didn't know nothing at all the rest of the day,
and preached a prayer-meeting sermon that night that gave him a rattling reputation, because the oldest man in the world couldn't have understood it. So Tom's Aunt Polly, she told all about who I was, and what, and I had to up and tell how I was in such a tight place that when Mrs. Phelps took me for Tom Sawyer, she chipped in and says, "Oh, go on and call me Aunt Sally. I'm used to it now, and 'tain't no need to change." And when Aunt Sally took me for Tom Sawyer, I had to stand it. There weren't no other way, and I knowed he wouldn't mind, because it would be nuts for him, being a mystery, and he'd make an adventure out of him and be perfectly satisfied. And so it turned out, and he let on to be Sid, and made things as soft as he could for me. And his Aunt Polly, she said Tom was right about old Miss Watson setting Jim free in her will. And so, sure enough, Tom Sawyer had gone and took all that trouble and bother to set a free nigger free. And I couldn't ever understand before, until that minute and that talk, how he could help a body set a nigger free with his bringing up. Well, Aunt Polly, she said that when Aunt Sally wrote to her that Tom and Sid had come all right and safe, she says to herself, "Look at that now. I might have expected it, letting him go off that way without anybody to watch him. So now I got to go and traps all the way down the river, 1100 mile, and find out what that creature's up to this time, as long as I couldn't seem to get any answer out of you about it." "Why, I never heard nothing from you," says Aunt Sally. "Well, I wonder. Why, I wrote to you twice to ask you what you could mean by Sid being here." "Well, I never got him, sis." Aunt Polly, she turns around slow and severe and says, "You, Tom." "Well, what?" he says, kind of pettish. "Don't you whop me, you impudent thing. Hand out them letters." "What letters?" "Them letters. I be bound if I have to take hold of you, They're in the trunk, there now, and they're just the same as they was when I got them out of the office. I hain't looked into them, I hain't touched them, but I knowed they'd make trouble, and I thought if you warn't in no hurry, Well, you do need skinning, there ain't no mistake about it. And I wrote another one to tell you I was coming, and I suppose No, it come yesterday. I hain't read it yet, but it's all right. I've got that one. I wanted to offer to bet $2 she hadn't, but I reckon maybe it was just as safe to not to. So I never said nothing. End of chapter 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri in July, 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter The Last. The first time I catched Tom private, I asked him what was his idea, time of the evasion. What it was he'd planned to do if the evasion worked all right and he managed to set a nigger free that was already free before. And he said what he had planned in his head from the start, if we got Jim out all safe, was for us to run him down the river on the raft and have adventures plumb to the mouth of the river, and then tell him about his being free and take him back up home on a steamboat in style, and pay him for his lost time, and write word ahead and get out all the niggers around and have them waltz him into town with a torchlit procession and a brass band, and then he would be a hero, and so would we. But I reckoned it was about as well the way it was. We had Jim out of the chains in no time, and when Aunt Polly and Uncle Silas and Aunt Sally found out how good he helped the doctor-nurse Tom, they made a heap of fuss over him, and fixed him up prime, and give him all he wanted to eat, and a good time, and nothing to do. And we had him up to the sick room, and had a high talk, and Tom give Jim $40 for being prisoner for us so patient, and doing it up so good. And Jim was pleased most to death, and busted out, and says, "There now, Huck, what'd I tell you? What'd I tell you up there on Jackson Island? I told you I got a hairy breast, and what's the sign in it, and I told you I been rich once, and gwine to be rich again, and it's come true, and here she is. There now, don't talk to me. Signs is signs, mind I tell you, and I know just as well as I's gwine to be rich again as I's a-standing here this minute." And then Tom, he talked along and says,
Let's all three slide out of here one of these nights and get an outfit and go for howling adventures amongst the Injuns over in the Territory for a couple of weeks or two. And I says, all right, that suits me, but I ain't got no money for to buy the outfit, and I reckon I couldn't get none from home because it's likely Pap's been back before now and got it all away from Judge Thatcher and drunk it up. No, he hain't, Tom says. It's all there yet, $6,000 and more, and your Pap hain't ever been back since. Hadn't when I come away, anyhow. Jim says, kind of solemn, he ain't a-comin' back no mo', Huck. I says, why, Jim? Never mind why, Huck, but he ain't comin' back no mo'. But I kept at him, so at last he says, don't you 'member the house dat was floating down the river, and dey was a man in there, covered up, and when I went in and uncovered him and didn't let you come in? Well, then you can get your money when you wants it, 'cause dat was him. Tom's most well now, and got his bullet around his neck on a watch-guard for a watch, and is always seeing what time it is. And so there ain't nothing more to write about, and I am rotten glad of it, because if I'd knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it, and ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the Territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The end. Yours truly, Huck Finn. End of chapter the last, and end of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, by Mark Twain.